I'm giving it a few minutes just to let people come in. It always takes a while. People are coming online, so great. Still giving it a second. I see numbers going up. Very good morning, everyone, and welcome to this EPC Policy Dialogue on addressing today's crisis, aligning short-term measures with long-term goals. I'm Annika Hedberg. I'm Head of Sustainable Prosperity for Europe Program at EPC, and I'll be moderating today's event. Today's discussion is part of EPC's Green Deal for Real series, under which we hope to encourage discussion on ways to turn our solemn declarations about making Europe more sustainable, resilient, and prosperous into real action. This is into action that starts today. And today's discussion marks also the beginning of our new project, kindly supported by the European Climate Foundation, under which we'll explore how the EU can and should manage the current and future crisis in a way that delivers immediate and long-term benefits for people, businesses, and the planet. I should also mention that the event is also getting some support from the European Union, and my colleagues will be sending you a survey which will kindly ask you to fill in after this event. As 1 year has now passed since Russia started its ruthless war on Ukraine, the horrors of this war and its numerous repercussions, including for our economy, for our society, for our energy and food systems, are rightly at the center stage in European debate today. But unfortunately, the pressures created by this war come on top of multiple other challenges the EU is struggling with. We are still battling with the economic and social repercussions of the pandemic. We are affected by wider geopolitical tensions and competition over resources. And the planetary crisis, from climate emergency to ecological destruction, are casting a long shadow over us, and the urgency to address these is growing by the day. This all is surely a lot to take in and manage, be it for politicians, businesses, or citizens. But at the same time, we should keep in mind that how we address these challenges will not just have immediate, but also longer-term impacts for Europe. And the consequences of our actions will not just be felt in Europe, but also outside our borders. So if we want to achieve sustainable prosperity, it is in our interest to do our best to align our short-term crisis responses with our long-term objectives, including those set in the European Green Deal. And this is what we'll discuss today. We'll reflect on the decisions and investments made in the last years, what has worked, what not, as well as the measures needed now to address the ongoing and future crisis in a way that benefits the society, the economy, and the planet. To start off our discussion, we're honored and excited to have with us today speakers that will surely shake up the debate and make us think outside the box. We'll start with interventions from Hans Bruyninckx, Executive Director from European Environment Agency, Danielsson, State Secretary for EU Affairs from Government of Sweden, and Stanley-Radière, Director for Climate Transparency at World Business Council for Sustainable Development, as well as Katherine Trebeck, co-founder at Wellbeing Economy Alliance. Thank you for joining us today. Our panelist interventions will then be followed by 3 short follow-up reactions from Helena Marschall from Fridays for Future Movement, from Daniel Bradley from UK Mission to the EU, and Dominic Gogol from Women Business Coalition. And after this, I'll turn to you, our dear audience, for your comments, for your questions. But already during the panel discussion, feel free to use the chat to post your questions or indicate your interest to speak. And I'll turn to you after we've heard from our speakers. Now, to get us started, Hans Bruyninckx, Executive Director from European Environment Agency. How good has the EU been in addressing the multiple crises it faces today? And in your mind, how could we better align our short-term reactions with our long-term goals? Thank you. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Annika. Thanks for the introduction and for the invitation. It's always a pleasure to work together with you. Well, I think we are having this timely discussion in a world that some describe as the VUCA world, volatile. And I think after the last several years, people understand what volatile means with COVID and Ukraine and other issues. Uncertain. The European Green Deal was framed at the very end of 2019 and then early 2020. And then all of this started to happen. And to quote the great strategic thinker Mike Tyson, we all have a plan and then you get punched in the nose. Voila, that's how reality has been. Complexity with the Ukrainian crisis, which is of course a war, a security issue, but also a deep social crisis, a geopolitical crisis, but other elements as well are deeply complex. If you think back of the Sharm el-Sheikh COP, the loss and damage debate is a deeply complex debate in today's world, and ambiguous. We're shifting our sourcing of fossil fuels in Europe to other countries that are obviously often not very democratic, where rule of law is problematic. So, I mean, all of these things matter. And we're also dealing with what some call super wicked problems or crises. And those have a number of characteristics, like time is running out. And I do think that that sense of urgency and the understanding of how we can speed up necessary responses is really important. Also, the future is discounted irrationally, which I think we see with climate change and biodiversity. These will not be linear crises and disruptions, and we don't understand that very well in policy terms. Those who are causing the problem are supposed to be part of the solution. And when people say, what does that mean? I say, well, they meet in Davos every year because we will need these actors to create the solutions, but they've also been deeply linked to our patterns of production and consumption and geopolitics that we've had to lead us into these crises, and there is no central authority. So that's the world in which Europe is trying to respond to these crises. And from an environment and climate perspective, of course, we have the so-called triple planetary crisis: climate, biodiversity, and pollution. I would add human health to that as a fourth strong dimension. And I think here the key message from me is that these are not today's crises. These are crises that we've known for decades. We celebrated Stockholm plus 50 last year. If you go back to the Stockholm Declaration, it speaks exactly about the issues that we are talking about now. 1992, we had the Rio Conventions on climate, biodiversity, and the other one that is often forgotten, desertification, in other words, soil degradation, land degradation. If we would have done in the last 30 years what we promised each other to do, we would not be dealing with these crises in the same way. The summer of 22 in Europe was so-called unexpected. No, it was not unexpected. Scientists have been modeling what is happening in the climate for some time. Now, of course, COVID has been unparalleled as a crisis, but also there were scientists who were researching the sort of, logic of pandemics, zoonosis, and the fragility of our food system. I mean, these things have been researched. The same could be said for the crisis in the financial system in 2008, 2009. There was a vast literature on the sensitivity and vulnerability of our system. And even the Ukrainian crisis follows on a pattern of a decade-long Russian aggression in its border countries. So I think that is one element. These crises are unexpected and they hit us, but at the same time, there is a logic to them that I think we have underestimated in this. And the typical institutional response is to strengthen institutions once the crisis has passed. Europe has set up strong institutions on banks after the crisis. We are now strengthening ECDC, and we are strengthening institutions after the crisis has passed. Now, from a Green Deal perspective, I think it's fair to say that Europe has responded in many ways in an appropriate way. If you look at Next Generation Europe and the European Recovery and Resilience Facility, with a clear emphasis on supporting a green economic response, the Just Transition Fund with a link to the social dimension, the Green Deal investment plan, those are all, I think, appropriate responses when it comes to the financial and investment priorities. And I think the other remarkable thing is that since the COVID and this crisis and the macroeconomic context, it's remarkable how the European Green Deal has remained a stable needle on the compass. Yeah, the legislative train has continued to be on the tracks. We have responded on climate and energy by strengthening even the Fit for 55 and the European climate law, when you think of stronger ambitions on renewables and efficiency targets. So that is quite remarkable. There has been a strengthening of responses on critical materials, circular economy, resource efficiency, all to deal with vulnerability and dependency. So that is remarkable. But yeah, first the flowers, then the pot, I guess they say. I think we also need to recognize that we are starting to see serious pushbacks. And those are important to mention. And they refer to one of the questions you asked in preparation: what means are needed to further deal with these crises? Well, first of all, I think we need to complete the puzzle of the European Green Deal. We're dealing with long-term crises. That means the nature restoration law needs to pass. Soil health is critical to reach other goals. Resource efficiency and circular economy are going slowly, too slowly. I refer to the International Resource Panel work, which is absolutely clear on that. We need a food system approach that is credible, not only an agricultural approach, and there is a lot of work that needs to be done. The big pushback on the chemicals file I need to mention, because this is not helpful and needs to be tackled. And also the financial system. We've made great strides by coming with the whole taxonomy, and the European Investment Bank and Christine Lagarde of the central bank are leaders in that. But there is a massive financial system that we will need to get on board to fundamentally and structurally deal with the crises. Second set of measures is to pay much more attention to the socioeconomic model. I think it's fair to say that it's not enough to say the model is broke, or we need to focus on well-being economics. We need to bring this concept to serious policies. And we have a history there. Post-World War II, social welfare states in Europe were a massive joint undertaking that we all benefited from. I wouldn't be sitting here if it were not for that post-World War II consensus, because a lot of the things we enjoy were elitist. Good health, good education, access to public services, all of these things were there. So we need to think about taxes and subsidies, not only the environmentally harmful nature of them, but also social distribution. We need to start with things like social housing on a scale that really connects with the climate objectives, and things like natural capital accounting, which we need to lift up from intellectual exercises to core elements of thinking about where our economy is going. I'm near the end, Annika, do not despair. You know I stick to time. The other two critical elements, I would say, is innovation in our democracy. It is not enough to go to a voting booth and to push a button. We have serious challenges of legitimacy and credibility. And so I think more innovation in our democracies through things like deliberative democracy, citizen panels, there is a really strong movement growing there. Also citizen science involvement, where we don't stick to the mantra, we should explain to our citizens better. No, can we not speak with our citizens or even listen to them better and involve them in creating knowledge and understanding through citizen science projects? Again, there is a really good set of examples there. And then the final point, I think, is on better foresight. And we know that Vice President Šefčovič has really pushed that, but I think we need to make that more actionable and take the knowledge embedded in that much more seriously. So yes, we have responded in many ways in an appropriate manner, but at the same time, I think these crises also point at much deeper and structural elements that require fundamental attention. Thank you.
Thank you, Hans, for this excellent start for our discussion, and also for the very concrete suggestions that you made. And I'm sure that we'll be coming back to several of these in the discussion, and also I'm sure that some of our respondents will be keen to address the points made. Next, I'll hand over to Christian Danielsson, State Secretary for EU Affairs from Government of Sweden. Happy to hear how you see the state of play, and obviously with the Swedish presidency ongoing, it will be interesting to hear any reflections, considerations you have on how you hope to address the multiple challenges that we face. Thank you.
And you probably addressed me. I lost Hans for the last 5 minutes, and I was coming in just now. But thanks a lot for giving me this opportunity, and it's particularly relevant issues that we are going to discuss. I think looking back, and Hans was touching upon it very much, looking back, and I would like to go back sort of 10, 15 years, from the European cooperation has been very much focused on crisis management. It's been everything from the subprime crisis to the euro crisis, going forward to the migration crisis, and coming out of that one, we went into the COVID crisis. And then now we have this awful full-scale invasion by Russia of Ukraine. And that has taken a lot of political space within the cooperation in Europe, but also beyond. And I would argue that Europe has done quite well. It could have done better, but it has done quite well in meeting the challenges of those crises. And it's right, as Hans pointed to, that of course what comes out of the crisis is often to set up new structures in order to avoid similar crises in the future. And that was what happened with the financial crisis. That was also what we saw to some extent, and hopefully with all its elements when it comes to the migration crisis towards next year this time. And we saw it also, I think, quite remarkably in the way that the COVID crisis was handled, and also the gearing up of the support and unity in support of Ukraine when it comes to this awful aggression by Russia. But it's also true that the focus on crisis of this kind, which I wouldn't call short-term, but crisis rather, takes quite a bit of space of the more, shall we call it, long-term challenges. And here, the paradox is that we are sitting in a situation while we have these kind of crisis, geopolitical challenges, on the same time as we have clearly global challenges that we only can meet together, and together within the EU, but also globally. And I think that is the big challenge if we are looking ahead. And looking on them, well, there is clearly the issue about the green transition. And I would agree with Hans. I'm quite astonished by the way that EU has been able to stay on track when it comes to that one. But that being said, it's going to be a challenge in the future to stay that direction with Fit for 55 to begin with, but also with the other elements that needs to complement in order to live up to the very ambitious objectives that Europe has set. Climate neutrality by 2050. 55% reduction of greenhouse gases by 2030, and also the objectives on biodiversity and circular economy. So this is going to be a political challenge where I think the member states so far is on the right track, But we should not underestimate that this will be something where lots of efforts needs to be made, both on political level, but also in terms of forming the opinions. Another element where the global challenge is there is our partnership with, shall we say, the global south, and the way that we work together, trying to get that up on the agenda again, because it's quite clear that the challenges we have when it comes to the green transition is very much also linked to having them on board for that purpose on the multilateral level, but also in the way that these partners are able to do the necessary reforms and are able to have the capacity to do it. And here we have a role to play in order both to be an example of what kind of legislation and what kind of structures that can do this. I'm thinking, for instance, on the emission trading system, but also in terms of concrete assistance. So that's another element of challenge. So of course, then we have the big, also global challenge of the multilateral system, of the adherence to international law. And here we have just seen how breaches of that and very, very fundamental breaches have just taken place 364 days ago, where they started already before that. And how to handle that one, and how to be able to see to that we could come back to something which was the basis for quite a lot of our well-being since the Second World War, is going to be a major challenge, and that one Europe will play an important role. Now, for us to be able to do that, I think there are two conditions. One condition is that our system, and Hans was pointing to it, our system can deliver economic prosperity, deliver growth, deliver the kind of well-being in the society that is fundamental. And here, I think we need to reflect on issues such profound, in a sense, like competitiveness, seeing to that our economy can deliver. Because if we are not able to create that kind of economic development, then it's going to be difficult for us to take on the challenges of the future. And what I mean by that? Well, we need to look into issues such as how the internal market is functioning. We need to be able to work hard on seeing to that the trade becomes more prominent and that we are able to both support the WTO, but also enter into new free trade agreements. We need to have regulation, which is on the one hand meeting the challenges of the green transition, of the various where the regulation should play in and various other elements, but on the same time is framed in such a way that is not putting major blockages for us to move forward on innovation, or for that sake, scaling up innovation into new industries. We need to invest much more on research in order for that to create the ability. And we need to see to that the way that our economies work becomes more efficient. I think that is a challenge which the EU is well set to work on, because that is something we have done before. And the second element has to do with democracy, rule of law. In order for us to be able to project what we believe is good, is providing the well-being that we have today, and also provide a society which is fair. In that case, we need to see to that one develops and that rule of law is respected throughout the EU. We need to see to that democracy works well, and we should continue to promote that system also beyond our borders, because we should be clear, there is competition today. And if we are not able to show that our system can deliver both on the challenges that we have discussed, green transition, etc., but also when it comes to prosperity, then there are others out there who will say our system is all better on it. And that would be an awful sort of development. And I think I'll stop here.
Thank you so much, Christian. And I think that's what you were referring to when you were referring to the global context. I think that's essential, and very happy to come back to that. And it's not only the impacts that we're having outside, but also the assistance we can provide, but then also the leadership that we can provide for and the role model we can provide outside our borders. And thank you very much for picking up on this topic of competitiveness, because certainly moving forward, the transition that we need will not succeed if we do not bring business on board, if we do not find a way to create that kind of enabling framework where our businesses can prosper, and that's we will be able to prosper as an economy. And that provides me a nice bridge to our next speaker, Anna Stanley-Radière, Director for Climate Transparency at World Business Council for Sustainable Development. So looking at the role of business, role of industry in this transition amidst all these crises, happy to hear your thoughts on the rationale as well as the means, how we should be aligning the short-term responses with our longer-term goals.
Thank you so much, Annika. And I think everyone agrees here today, how we act today will definitely impact tomorrow, and the knowledge of where we're headed tomorrow, if we don't change how we act today, must impact how we act today. It's a bit of a complicated thought, I think, but you know, this connection between the short-termism and the long-termism, I think it's a really key notion, and something that you know, I want to share a couple of sort of, I guess, lessons learned, recommendations on what I think is needed, especially from the business perspective, and also some measures maybe, and highlighting a couple of examples from very specific parts of the work that's ongoing, especially in the European Union, of where we're already on the right track towards meeting some of those needs. So I think the sort of key lessons we've learned from all the different crises that have come up, and some of these have already been highlighted by some of the previous speakers, to me, they're really around the focus on short-termism is sort of not tenable in the long term, that we need to apply long-term thinking to all sectors and now really, and we're sort of, you know, should have been doing that for the past however many years, and it's sort of high time we get to that point. You know, and in line with that, we also need to act more proactively before crisis occurs, and we know many of these crises are heading our way. You know, I think COVID-19 is the best example of one of the crises where you knew it was going to come, and there are many others that sort of are in a similar vein. I also think a very key lesson learned is that we need to optimize our responses to enable greener, fairer, and more sustainable futures, embedding these concepts in responses as we sort of go towards addressing crises which occur. And all this requires a shift in the system. You know, Hans, I think, briefly touched upon it. But, you know, it is a shift that really takes a holistic approach around people and planet, equity, nature, climate, the interlinked nature between all these concepts. So it is sort of, in a way, moving away from the status quo of how we do things. But we know we can do it, and we've seen it time and time again, that if we want to, or we're forced to do it by the nature of the crises we face, we can actually move forward and deliver. So that, you know, the COVID-19 pandemic, for example, definitely highlighted cracks in our global systems around supply chains and the complexity of it all. But it also allowed us to reset and understand what's important in life, and highlight the resilience and the opportunity to rebuild a sort of new normal, which is a little bit more green and fair. And you know, that mobilization of resources at scale is possible. You sort of highlighted briefly, you know, sort of the impact and the financial impact of it. But, you know, everyone came together to mobilize that resource. So why are we not coming together in the same way to mobilize resource to address the climate crisis, to address the equity crisis, to address the biodiversity crisis? We can do it. And that really showed that aspects of the new Green Deal are definitely attainable if we change how we act. Russia's invasion of Ukraine, another very good example, which showed that the weaponization of energy resources, for example, is a key problem, and the dependence of key markets on fossil fuels and external providers. But it also showed how our food systems are flawed, with very, very strong regional dependencies. And at the same time, it provides an excellent opportunity to accelerate the green transition, moving towards, for example, the deployment of renewable sources to remove those dependencies and create more of a balance and a sort of a, you know, a level playing field across the world. And I think is something that has becomes really, really clear in these crises, that a lot of the progress we've made, especially in the Western world, is not necessarily positive progress if we're looking at sort of stability in the long term. And I think these examples sort of show us key lessons of how we need to change. And I realize it's easier said than done. Hans, I hear you loud and clear. Business plays a key role in making change, and we're here and we are willing to make that change. Our members at WBCSD are incredibly ambitious and really, you know, sort of are kind of coming up to us on all sorts of different challenges, wanting to change. Of course, there's always people sort of not part of wanting to make progress, but a lot of businesses are asking, how can I work towards helping achieve climate neutrality and all these other things which need to be addressed. And from my perspective, there's sort of three key things I'd like to highlight. collaboration, confidence, and capability building. So what I mean by that, collaboration between policymakers, the private sector, international organizations, it's key and really beneficial to driving progress on the technologies and tools needed for the transition, for example. And we see really, really strong evidence or sort of strong, examples of how the work that's already ongoing in the European Union actually supports that collaboration. For example, a very specific example from my day-to-day work on transparency, consistency, and comparability of product data. We have the EU product environmental footprint legislation coming up, the digital product passport, and the taxonomy work, which is really working to standardize and really define common standards. It's incredibly important to do work like that. It's really also important on the collaboration front that we have a sort of, and again, this notion has already come up, that we really value and put planet and people at the heart of market demand and market signals, and that the cost of capital is lowered for businesses that do good in this world. We've seen some work around incentivization to sort of, I guess, highlight more transparently where companies are going in the CSRD, but also the collaboration that's starting off with the International Sustainability Standards Board and others. So again, sort of collaboration really, it's a challenge, but there are things happening in this space. And it's also about, for example, enabling companies and the systems to price uncertainty and risk more in the long term, much more adequately. The carbon border adjustment mechanism, again, is a good example of something which is going to help in that. But we need to make sure that these sorts of methodologies or structures or rules really work globally and also bring in the realities of where business is at. I think that's really, really key, and the collaboration is going to be fundamental to achieve that. Confidence, we need to establish a space in where business can support the governments in implementing their policies and create partnerships at scale quickly in a way to sort of democratize green transition. It's really essential to build up confidence on progress and make clear signals and really show where governments and policymakers are at in the long term, so that business can make decisions knowing that they can trust on that in those decisions, and that they're not going to sort of, in 5 years' time, things are going to change again and they're going to have to reshift their policies, because businesses today make decisions for in 10 years' time. They don't make decisions just today. So again, for example, the sort of incentivization around that, and this sort of clear support signals like the EU Net Zero Industry Act are really, really key in making those signals very clear. And then maybe to finish off, I'd like to speak a little bit about capability building. We are not at a point today where we are ready for the transition we need to make. And I say this, I guess, with a realization that's also shocked me over the last couple of months and sort of years, to see that we don't have the skill sets needed, but we can get there if we put our money and our knowledge behind it. I think, for example, the SMEs, there's many SMEs out there that don't even know what, they don't have the financial incentives, but they also don't know how to move to better, greener energy, or how to actually change their business model and be rewarded for those changes in order to actually progress. So we need to make sure that we support that capability building globally with regional context. And again, I'd like to highlight one of the examples here, because I think it's really, really key to show what actually works well and what's going in the right direction. So the EU Covenant of Companies, which has been brought to life fairly recently to help support SMEs in their transition and help them support with resources and knowledge, is one of the key things. And it's sort of not a big thing, but it's a small policy or small structure which really can help shift the needle on this capability gap that we're facing today. So it's sort of those three things that I wanted to highlight, which I think are going to be really key in creating convergence and prioritization of long-term decision-making, and they will actually truly enable us to harness the opportunities that arise from some of these crises, to bring them and the knowledge and the lessons learned from that to the table, to move forward, to be able to not think about short-term and long-term and crisis management and sort of the future, but think of everything holistically together. I think we've seen what's possible. We know what we need to do, and we really just need to move towards making it happen. So thank you so much, Annika, and really excited to hear from the other speakers here today, because I think it's great to bring everyone together with these different perspectives. It's really, really what's needed to bring us forward into the next stone and age in this topic.
Thank you, Anna, so much for bringing your thoughts, reflections, insights, and also some of the concrete examples that you showed and shared with us. And in many ways, I think that discussion around creating that enabling framework and what is needed also for the businesses to move forward, what is needed for to incentivize, support them in that transition, I think it's essential. And while you're, of course, referring to the global environment, at the moment, EU does have a number of tools it can do. It can use, it could be using much better to support the businesses in this transition as well. So hopefully we'll have time to go into some of these concrete tools that we do have available, because obviously that transition needs to start now and there's no time to waste. Katherine Trebeck, co-founder for Wellbeing Economy Alliance. We've heard and we've been making several references to wellbeing economy in the discussion today. So can you enlighten us and share your thoughts on the rationale, but then also the means on how we could achieve a well-being economy in this crisis-prone world where it often feels that we are at times also short-sightedly just trying to manage the multiple crises and failing to look into the future that we really want.
Thank you, Annika, and thank you so much to the European Policy Centre for putting on this discussion. Really, really great to be here and looking forward to hearing from the audience in a few minutes. So I want to start with a quote, and it says that the individualistic capitalism, the hands of which we find ourselves in now, is not a success. It's not intelligent, it is not beautiful, it is not just, and it does not deliver the goods. In short, we dislike it and we are beginning to despise it. And I think if we take a few of those words, we can certainly see the resonance today that it's not intelligent. We see that governments and other agencies have to spend a lot of resources responding to the fallout and the collateral damage of how we do things today, whether that's cleaning up and repairing after environmental disasters or helping people survive and cope with an unjust economic system that is not helping them put food on the table, helping them keep shelter over their heads. It's not beautiful. Well, we can see that all too often around us with the extent of environmental destruction. It's not just. I don't think I need to tell this audience about the incredible level of horizontal and vertical inequalities. We've heard today around the well-being we have today. I think not enough people have enough well-being. We see that too many people are being left behind. And the phrase, we're beginning to despise that. I think we see people just checking out, or we see people reaching for coping mechanisms, whether that's at the pillbox or at the ballot box. So that quote went on. It said, when we wonder what to put in its place, we are extremely perplexed. Now, those words I have just shared with you were written 90 years ago by John Maynard Keynes. So 90 years on, we are not short of visions. We are not short of ideas. We are not short of practices that show us what a more humane, more sustainable economic system can look like. And the term the wellbeing economy, I often think a little bit like a picnic blanket on which all sorts of related concepts around how the economy needs to be transformed are welcome and where their commonality is brought to the fore. And what they share in common is a fundamental rethinking about the role of the economic system, asking harder questions about the economy, who it is for, how it is structured, production and consumption systems, and really understanding that the economy is not so much a goal in its own right, but we need to listen to what ecological economists have been telling us for decades, what feminist economists have been telling us for decades, and to be really honest, what First Nations communities around the world have been living for millennia, that the economy is a subset of society and the two are nested within our precious natural world. And we then need to think of the economy as being in service of those higher order goals of delivering the sort of society we want on a healthy planet. And so in practical terms, how do we get there? So we've already heard of the sort of changes that we need. And I dare to say it's almost like a 1,000-piece jigsaw puzzle, the sort of shifts we need at all levels of our economic system, right through to very local community gardens, to local public transport systems in cities, to how we do energy systems, right up to the global supranational economic architecture. But if you're doing a jigsaw puzzle with 1,000 pieces, where are you going to start? You always start with the corners. So you heard from Anna, these lovely 3 C's. I want to give you the 4 P's, those corners of the wellbeing economy jigsaw puzzle. So the 4 P's are purpose, prevention, pre-distribution, and people powered. So in terms of purpose, this is about being fair weather friends of economic growth rather than its ever faithful followers. So really questioning what sort of growth do we need, for whom and for where and how. So very explicitly thinking about the direction and the composition rather than just the rate. So really, and making sure our measures are up for that. At the micro level, it's the sort of businesses that Annika works with, those businesses that have a very clear purpose and are seeing themselves as part of the solution. In terms of prevention, this is saying it is not good enough just to keep spending money helping people and planet survive and cope with today's system. We have to be more ambitious than this. We have to do what I'm often saying is channel your inner 3-year-old by constantly asking, but why, looking upstream beyond just the symptoms of crisis by crisis by crisis, because when you look upstream, you see how the way we design our economic system links them all. And so being bold enough to take action at source, that's a very different way of working for a lot of government systems. It means much more collaboration, and as we've heard, much more long-term thinking than so often is apparent. The 3rd P is pre-distribution. And this is essentially saying we have to do better than just redistributing after the fact. We also have to ask the economy to do more of the heavy lifting in delivering the sort of outcomes that we want, more equal outcomes. And the sort of pieces of the jigsaw puzzle that you might see here are things that share economic resources better, whether that's worker cooperatives, whether it's a community wealth building agenda, whether it's true cost accounting, as we've already heard a little bit about, those sorts of things that make the market work the way we want it to. And then the final one, and this really picks up one of the points that Hans was making around democratic innovation, is people powered, making sure that people feel in control and at the forefront of the decisions that affect them. So things like participatory democracy, participatory budgeting, citizens' assemblies. And I've been asked to think about, are there some examples in Europe that show what this looks like? And this is a good news story, because while this is a really fundamental rethinking, we are not short of chinks of light that show us what this looks like, whether it's coming from the corridors of government or from the boardrooms and factory floors and innovation centres of businesses, or from our community halls and pubs and football fields across Europe. So conversations, I think, are happening really nicely. And you've heard about some of the tangible action already. But the conversations that I'm seeing bubbling up that give me heart are the fact that in a few months' time in May, there's a Beyond Growth conference sponsored by the European Commission. We're seeing addressing insecure work right at the heart of conversations at the European Union through the Pillar on Social Rights. We're seeing discussions, as already been mentioned, around things like extended producer responsibility, really saying whose responsibility is it for the resources that people use. And we've got the 8th Environmental Action Plan that's an explicit statement of the need to create a wellbeing economy. And member states too are certainly rolling up their sleeves and putting in place little pieces of that jigsaw puzzle, not nearly joined up sufficiently, but getting there. So things like conditionality on businesses during COVID support schemes, I think led by Denmark with its conditionality in terms of they're not giving funds and business support for enterprises that were using tax havens. We see circular economy enterprises flourishing in places like the Netherlands. We see Sweden's tax reductions on repairing goods and services. We see France and Italy banning food waste. We see car-free cities and streets across Europe. We see free public transport in Finland. We see community energy in Denmark, Amsterdam's sharing city, Barcelona's community land trust. In Italy, we've got Emilia Romagna with all its support around worker cooperatives. Is that enough? Absolutely not. What we need to do is mainstream these sorts of examples and those like them so that we head to a new normal. In terms of what role for member states, this is about setting the rules of the game. And as you've already heard, particularly from Christian, this is about leadership through practice and the investment. And also I'd add to that, this is one of the best roles for government is for underwriting community solutions. So often communities know what needs to happen. They know what we need more of. What they need is that risk taken out of it so that they can get on and deliver it. And as you've heard from Anna, this is about also bringing out the best of businesses. Businesses have got so much potential to be part of the solutions here. So it's about being, yes, commercially viable, yes, making a profit, but for perhaps a bigger purpose than just short-term profit for its own sake. And again, there are plenty of examples. We see shareholders on boards, as you know, Germany's particularly well known for, foundation companies in Denmark, co-ops in Italy and Spain, and so on. And finally, for people, I was asked to think about what does this mean for people? One of the key roles for any individual is to support those pioneers that they see in their neighborhoods, in their cities, on their high street, because the more we support those pioneers, the more others will replicate them. And then the final thing is to ask harder questions of the economy. It's not okay just to be told the economy is the way it is and there's nothing we can do about it. As we heard, we've seen before in the post-war era when the economy was deliberately designed to deliver what communities needed. We can turn it around and deliver it again. So we need to dare to ask, what is the purpose of the economy? Who is it operating for? And can we imagine something better than the economic system we have today? Thanks, Annika.
Thank you so much, Katherine, for all your insights and really getting us to think about what the future could look like, and also for all these small examples, because I think that it's really positive and brings in this idea that everyone on all levels of society, changes can be made, and that can start today, although ultimately, of course, we do need that system change, and that is the ultimate goal. But and when you were talking about the people and how we should be supporting pioneers and asking harder questions, there's no better time for that in Europe than now, when Europe is already starting to discuss the upcoming elections, and that will certainly give a channel for people to pose those hard questions on politicians on an EU level. And hopefully we'll see a lot of that. I'll now hand over and give a chance. We have, as I mentioned, 3 reactions, short reactions. And I would like to invite first Daniel Bradley, Head of Climate and Environment from UK Mission to the EU, to share his short reflections on what you've heard today. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Annika. It's a real pleasure to hear such a great panel, a really great way to start the morning, and great to be working with EPC as well. It's what we've come to expect, starting such a great conversation. So it will be so easy to just talk for a long time, to repeat everything everyone's just said, because we heard such great ideas. So what I wanted to do is draw together maybe 4 brief areas where I think we agree. I think we agree on the overlapping challenges, and I think Hans did a great job of setting that out, and particularly the fact that these are complex, they're uncertain, they're volatile, and it's coping with that uncertainty, but remembering that these are not completely uncertain. Some of these are known things that we've been working on for a while. We just need to remind ourselves of what's important and get to it. So I think we agree on the challenges. I think we agree largely on what's important as well. And I think Anna reminded us on focusing on a future that's green and fair, because that tends to be good for everyone. It's good for our prosperity and our security, not just for people and planet. The third area where I think we agree also, which I was relieved to hear, is that that there are reasons to be positive. And this is something I really care passionately about, because climate change, which is what I spend a lot of my time thinking about, is really the greatest challenge of the 21st century. But the fact also remains is that low carbon development is the growth opportunity of the 21st century. And I think what the panelists encouraged us to do is how do we step into that opportunity? That really resonates with me, because it's really the message that in the UK that we're grappling with at the moment. So we've just had a review of net zero. And I think one of the big messages from that review is there is no growth story if it's not a green growth story. And I think that really resonates with some of the messages that we've heard today. Another reason to be positive. I think, again, the big milestone that we had with the UK was COP26 in Glasgow. And prior to COP26, we were heading for a 4-degree world based on the commitments that we had on the table. After Glasgow, it was closer to 2 point something. Now, clearly not good enough. We need to get to 1.5. But that's a massive shift, and we should not sort of underestimate the gravity of what we've managed to achieve. But just to keep the momentum going is the important thing. Also, the commitments to net zero that we've seen prior to Glasgow, there were around 30% of the global economy was covered by a net zero goal. After Glasgow, 90% of the global economy is committed to a net zero goal. I guess the challenge now is to make sure that that is not an empty target, that it has real plans and action behind it. But what I liked from what the panel was saying is that those goals are not empty. They send a very, very clear signal to the market, and that's what we need. That's what we need to drive action. I guess the other reason to be cheerful is I think we're seeing how we're decoupling growth and emissions. And again, from our own perspective, the UK has grown its economy by over 70% while reducing emissions by over 40%. So it shows that it's possible. We're also weaning ourselves off coal. It would have been unthinkable a decade ago to think that coal was maybe 40% of our electricity mix. It's now less than 2%. And it just shows that some of these things are actually possible. But in driving that kind of change, I think the panel also reminded us there's a role for all parts of economy and society. Anna, Katherine really stressed the equity point. I think that's super important. Also, the role of business to drive change. And the other thing that makes me feel positive is the way that businesses are often driving governments much faster. It's not governments telling business, you must do more. You must think about your emissions, you must think about maybe taking a net zero goal. What I hear big businesses saying particularly is, let's go faster, please give us a target, then we have certainty and we know what we're going to chase down, we know where to innovate. And I think that's a really stimulating reality of the role of the private sector, but also the importance of voice of civil society and holding leaders to account. We need that. We need people to keep us honest. We need people to push us to do more and better and ensure that the transition is just and that people have some agency in how they shape change, how they participate in it, and how they benefit from it. But the final agreement that I wanted to highlight is it's good to remind us of what's going well. I think we do need that. They're useful reference points because we learn from them. But I think we've agreed that we need to do more. I like the point Anna made that we're not yet ready, but that we can do it if we put our minds and our money to it. And this point about boldness that Katherine made, and boldness, as we know, has genius, power, and magic in it. So I think it's good to be bold and be relentless in innovation and support pioneers, as Katherine was saying. But I think also about being more forward-leaning on partnership and on collaboration together with competition. How do we strike that balance between collaboration and competition? And there, I'm really pleased that Christian reminded us of the Global South, because I think while we're putting together solutions for our own prosperity, our own sustainability, we need to do so in a way that really recognizes the interconnectedness of this, and that includes different types of country that are interconnected in different ways, but also making sure that that equity piece is at the front and center of what we do. And I think how we do that, we've heard a lot about working together. I'm very passionate about knowledge partnerships, about sharing ideas, sharing lessons, because I believe that the evidence shows us that we will go further and faster together when we're tackling problems that we cannot fix on our own. And again, there are points of things like the breakthrough agendas that came out of Glasgow at COP26 in very specific sectoral areas, where it was just really about putting people together in like-minded groups, not linked to the negotiations, just countries, businesses, other actors that just wanted to push forward change and wanted to put their heads together on how to do it. We also need to sort out the money, as we were reminded by the panel, get the flows in the right places, drive prices down. We need to skill people up. We need to address capability gaps, as Anna was saying. And we need all these things to build this idea of a greener, fairer world with fewer dependencies, fewer inequities, make our economy in service of those kind of goals. That was a nice phrase of Katherine's. Let's not check out. As Katherine said, we need hope, because action is underpinned by hope. And I think we need that as we really push forward a decade of action where we really roll our sleeves up, we keep asking good questions, and we keep working together, because as I said, I think we'll go further and faster if we do so together and get to it. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan, so much. And in these, I think what I really take away is that we do need hope, is that the action requires seeing that there is hope amidst all these multiple crises that we're facing, and we know that there will be so many more. So how do we actually keep up that optimist mind that we can do it? I'll then hand over to Dominic Gogol, Deputy Director at We Mean Business Coalition. So coming back again and again, we hear the role for the businesses, and very happy to hear your additional reflections on this. Thanks.
Great, thanks very much, Annika. Morning, everyone. Yes, I think I'd like to pull out a few kind of nuggets from what was said earlier by the speakers, which was a really interesting set of remarks that really kind of swept us through all the type of kind of societal and economic change which has happened globally and that Europe's been in the brunt of over the last 10 years. And I was particularly pleased for Hans to use one of my favorite quotes from Mike Tyson, because I think it's so appropriate in the policy landscape where academic or political or policy plans which are thought through run into the harsh economic reality, and about how, as policymakers and people who work in the policy field kind of respond to that, what is the resilience of the policy proposals which are being put forward. And I think Christian took us through kind of how Europe's been in a place since the 2007 and 8 financial crisis of not constant crisis, but dealing with many multifaceted challenges. And so far, the European institutions have bent and they've reformed, but they've remained strong, and the member states have kind of responded within the European institutions. And the role of the Green Deal itself from its inception in 2019 has already survived enormous change with the global pandemic in 2020 and 2021, and then the first European land war in a generation and an energy crisis. And through that, policy processes and files have been progressed. Ambition has even been raised. And I think the process has worked, and we're now nearing the end of the Fit for 55 package with areas that need to be addressed, but it has kind of come through challenges which no one could have foreseen in 2019, and has come out the other side with progress made, confidence just about maintained between the European institutions and with business. And now we need to really get on the front foot in terms of how it can be delivered. And that's why I thought Anna's remarks was very important in terms of the role for business and how we particularly bring confidence into this, and how we maintain confidence into the enormous changes which are happening. And that's both in terms of with the public and bringing them along in this journey, both as kind of consumers, but also as voters, particularly, but also bringing business along in this, where business often need policy certain, maybe not necessarily certainty, but policy confidence that the direction of travel over the next 5 to 10 years is set. And now we're very much working with policymakers in terms of how it can be delivered. And on that, I wanted to use this opportunity to flag the Science-Based Target Initiative, which is the leading business climate initiative in terms of how companies set emissions target and reduce against them. It's now at 4,500 companies globally, representing 30 or 40 trillion dollars of revenue, and that has increased over the last 2 years through economic challenges, through energy crisis. The number of companies, particularly in Europe, is increasing, and the companies are willing to set targets, and they see the direction of travel is clear, and that they want to be developing the technologies and services of the future that we all need. And finally, I thought Katherine gave a great kind of sweep in terms of kind of the economic challenges and the kind of the probing need for us within the policy landscape to keep asking why. And with a toddler, I'm very used to receiving those constant questions, and it does make you reevaluate why do we do these practices the way we do? Could they be reformed? Could they be improved? How do we identify the real drivers of change? And how do we reform them in an appropriate manner? And with that, I wanted to finish in terms of in the light of Katherine's very strong examples of the change which is happening that we might not see day to day, or we only see it in our limited context within the city and community we live in, but we don't know what's happening in other cities in Europe or globally, but it kind of maintains kind of trust and confidence that this change to a clean energy transition is happening, is the Bloomberg figures from last month, which show the total investment in the clean energy economy is now over $1.1 trillion, which has eclipsed the investment that went into the fossil fuel economy, and that in itself is important, and that change is getting close to being kind of exponential, at least on the investment side, which is so important. But actually, if you drill down, it's even more encouraging in terms of the investment in renewables in 2022 was nearly $500 billion, which was up 17% from the year before, which is significant. But it's in transport, where the electrification for transport, the investment globally was $466 billion, which is a 54% increase from the year before. So 54% in 1 year increase in electrification in transport. And that's not just public money, that's investment from auto manufacturers, from investors themselves. So the change is happening. We just need to create better ways of representing and kind of consistently reinforcing that to voters, to companies, to policymakers as we go through this process.
Thank you so much, Dominic, for your thoughts. As our last reaction, we have Helena Marschall from Fridays for Future movement. It's a lot of the reactions, that the measures that are being taken today obviously will be felt by our younger generations. So Helena, what would be your message to our leaders today, hearing all what you've heard and knowing the pressures that we're under?
Hi, thank you so much for having me. I'm really happy that we're having this conversation, and I think that the fundamental question is, how can we align like short-term crisis response with these like long-term or middle-term policy goals and perspectives? And I think I kind of want to add 2 points and then highlight something as well, because I think that fundamentally, we're in a situation where if we want things to stay the way that they are, then everything, or at least a lot of things, need to change. And I think that and I know that's kind of our role as climate activists, to keep saying that things are not enough, but things are not enough, right? We have a Green Deal that, I mean, it's incredible that that policy process was able to move forward under these multiple crises that we are facing. And everybody we talked to said that in the end, more was in this package than they thought was possible at this moment. But we still know it's not enough, right? So if we look at 1.5 degrees, we know that the Green Deal has a lot of important instruments, but does not bring us all the way there. And when we look at European LNG capacities, where we have a really big problem that we could be kind of moving from one fossil fuel crisis into the next fossil fuel crisis, where we have overcapacities by 2030 of almost 5 times that of what we imported from Russia before the start of the full-scale invasion. And that is really, really dangerous. And I think that the question is, how can we really like base all these big ideas and these visions that are there and that do exist in the concrete policy that is being made? I think that's the first important point. And I think the other important point is that we are in a situation where we have all these multiple pressures. And I think that is a situation where not just the policy is important and not just the actual factual what is being done is important, but also how do we communicate with the people who are feeling these pressures, who are feeling these crises, and who are also trying to work against them, like my movement. And I think that it's important that we expect, like, and we can ask more of people, we can be honest that it's not going to be an easy decade, right? It's going to be rocky, but if we do some things right, then we can still win a lot of things and we can still make a lot of good. I think that at the end of the day, change is happening everywhere. I think that was a really important point. People are working on solutions, and I think that hope is active, right? Hope is not just something we have, it's something we make and something we build every single day by making concrete change. And I think at the end of the day, we can do things, but only if we really, really work very hard at this moment, and also are honest about where we're falling short at the moment, and only if we're honest about every single policy decision, because at the end, it doesn't, if we're doing some things right, that's great, but if we're undermining them by doing other things wrong, then we're not going to get where we need to go. And so I think that's really important. I think it's not easy, right? I think what we heard these points of like complexity and so on, and it's really not easy. Like, I have so much sympathy for people who are still like, who are coming up with answers in this moment where there's so many pressures. But honestly, that's where we are. That's the situation where we are in. And I think that in a way, as a movement, we do not have all the answers. We do not know because we've never been in this kind of situation where there's so many pressures at once, but we do know that these answers exist. And I think that's the most important point. So I'm very, I think those are my points, and I'm very happy to hear the further discussion.
Thank you, Helena. Thank you so much for joining us. And now for our audience, just to say, I look forward to your questions, comments, and I see this, we already have some, and I'll also obviously want to give a chance for our speakers to react to what they have heard in the course of the discussion. We certainly have fired away a lot of ideas, and we have a lot of visions. We know where we want to go. I'll combine a few questions together. First, I would like to pick up on what Helena said here, picking up on LNG capacity and risk of having overcapacity. And I would like to pick on our speakers and pose the question that, do you see examples of recent decisions, measures that have been taken at EU and or national level to manage the multiple crises that we're facing at the moment that could actually result in unwanted risks and cost for people, businesses, and the planet? What harm has already potentially been done, and how good and should any such decisions, measures be corrected? And another question we have, it's from Stefan Sipka, from a colleague from EPC, concerning the ongoing food crisis. How can we align our short-term measures to increase food security and resilience with the long-term goals of the European Green Deal? So I'll start with these two questions, and I'm especially interested to hear from our panelists. Who would like to go first? Hans, please.
Yeah, well, thanks for all the interventions. I thought they were fascinating. There's so much, a wealth of information in those. On the skills question that was out there also in the chat, I think this is not rocket science. I mean, there is actually an agency in the European system that deals with skills and education for the labor market. They have just come out with fabulous work on skills for the green economy. It's really a fantastic overview with very concrete interventions. So I would guide people towards that work. On the LNG question that you just said, I think for me there is of course the risk of short-termism that has been discussed, but I would coin also increasingly the risk of medium-termism, where we don't look at 2030 or 2040 as an end goal. It should be a stepping stone towards 2050, and so we can be lured in to making investments into so-called transition solutions that actually are rather expensive, that will not outlive their economic write-off time, and so become stranded assets, and that prevent the absolutely necessary breakthrough investments in the other economic model. And that includes other business models, other technologies, and that is where I think some of the big current systemic players are pushing, because it stays within their sort of concept and technology. And it's also where some of the easier solutions are to be found in policy, because they stay within the policy concepts that we have, but they're not long-term solutions. Are they sometimes needed? Yes, but I would be very careful with them, because they can further lock you into solutions that are never going to help us to reach 2050. And if I may make a last comment, I fully agree with Helena that yes, we see a lot of movement, but it's not enough. We're 30 years into the UNFCCC, and the net result is not even a bending of the trend of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, not even a bending of the trend. We emit 60% more, so it is not enough. I fully agree with that. So it is about speeding up and scaling up credible solutions to bring us towards 1.5, incredibly difficult, as some doubt it very fundamentally at the moment, but every 1/10 of a degree matters because of that non-linearity of impacts, and the IPCC is crystal clear there. So fully agreeing with her on that one.
And Hans, would you like to react to the question on the food security and how to address?
Yeah, well, yes, briefly. I think, and this may sound a bit harsh, bold, as Dominic would say. I think boldness is needed there. There is no big issue of food security in Europe. There is an issue of food security in the world. So misusing the Ukrainian crisis to stop certain reforms in the European food system because we have a big food crisis is disingenuous, is unhelpful, and is putting the focus on the wrong area of the world. I think Europe should take responsibility also, as far as possible, for the food shortages, food crisis, food insecurity of a lot of people on this planet, and not misuse the Ukrainian crisis for purposes of stopping reform in our food system, agricultural system, financial system. It's not helpful. It distracts, it's disingenuous, and I would even call it unethical.
Thank you, Hans. Looking at our other speakers who may want to come in. Christian?
Yeah, no, thanks a lot. No, just I was struck by some of the interventions here, which I find very, very interesting, and that is how society is changing. I have had the pleasure over the last couple of months to have lots of interaction with industry. And what strikes me is how many times I hear that our customers, our clients, they call for sustainability. They call for us to look into sustainable way of producing, sustainable way of the way that our value chains are being set out, etc., etc. And I think that is a force that is quite important to sort of cherish and see to that it develops and becomes in full stream. And that we need to look into regulations, so that regulations are in such a way that they are conducive to that further development and further direction. The other thing I'm also had the pleasure over the last 6 months to see is innovation. How much innovation there is out there, which is driven by the need for green transition. And that goes from everything from what we have here as fossil-free steel to the way that microchips are being developed for the future. And I think also there we need to reflect on how that one can be further cherished and how that can go further. And that link to that one is the whole digital transition, which is ongoing on the same time, which also has a clear link towards the green transition. And that's everything from the way that artificial intelligence will work in the future to just how we can use the digital transition for more green solutions. And all of that will call for, I think, more efforts in that direction, seeing to that our regulation system is framed in such a way that it's conducive, but it's also going to call very much for both investments and skills. And here the European system has a role to play, but I would also argue that the way that we are interacting with the Global South also needs to take this into account. And I'll stop here.
Thank you. And I know, Anna, you wanted to come in as well.
Yeah, I sort of wanted to build on something that Hans said, and I guess I said it, you know, sort of at the side of what my intervention earlier, but I think what's really core in this space is the understanding of sort of the linkage between equity, nature, and climate action, and sort of how, you know, if you're making decisions in one space, it'll affect the other spaces. And there's sort of, you know, not an either or, but it has to be holistic decision making. So I think that's one space where I still see there's a need to move to a much more integrated agenda that tries to address everything at once, rather than optimizing, for example, for, you know, sort of carbon reduction, but not thinking about what it actually means in practice for supply chains, you know, in I don't know, the global South, for example. So I think that's one of the key points, you know, in this, where I think there is some movement towards that, but alone the fact that we have a biodiversity COP and we have a climate COP shows very clearly that we're not at the point where sort of that agenda is seen together. And let's not even talk about equity, because I think equity is really the least mature space, you know, on the agenda. So I really want to highlight that, because I think it's key in order to be able to move towards progress and not have some of these, I guess, loose ends or activities which end up actually causing more harm in the long run, because they're sort of, go in a direction which in 10 years time we don't need the energy anymore, as as sort of Helena was highlighting. I think if we think about the whole picture, as one, and make the decisions and put the policies in place, and also from the business side, take actions that balance all these different things, I think that's the right way forward to ensuring that we don't go down dead ends, or we don't go down ending up having things which are not useful in the long run.
Thanks, Anna. And Katherine, there's also a question for you from Ilias Yakovidis. That's, is there any collected set of best practices, wisdom of the First Nations that could be instantiated to today's situation, provide guidance to policymakers? So feel free to react to what you've heard, but then also if you wish to take on this question, that would be great.
Was that from First Nations specifically?
The question is that, is there any collected set of best practices, wisdoms of the First Nations?
Okay. Oh, lovely question. I'll answer that briefly. Elias, no. And if you find one, please let me know. But there's a book I can recommend from a First Nations Australian called Sand Talking, and it's First Nations wisdom for, I can't remember the subtitle, but it's First Nations wisdom for sorting out the global economy. And it's got rave reviews. It's on my shelf here. I haven't had a chance to dip into it yet, but Sand Talking is a place I'd start. And there's also a beautiful report from the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation several years ago now, called Beyond Development, Latin American Alternatives. So that's an absolutely cracking report, Elias, I'd dive into. I just want to say really quickly, because it'd be great to get to more questions, around a couple of remarks on the food crisis. I mean, I think so often how responses to the food crisis are, as we've seen discussed with a lot of other things, too short-term and too narrow. I mean, the fact that 50 to 30% of food is wasted, whether in the majority world that's between farm and gate, or in places like the EU, between shop and plate, just shows that it's not lack of food itself. It's not that our planet isn't providing for us. It's not as if there's not enough kilojoules out there to provide for every single human being on the planet. The issue is our other systems, our transport systems, our supply systems, how we also think about provision of food and sharing it. So that's where the issue is. And so we so often, again, need to, as I say, channel your inner 3-year-old up to what are the drivers of some of that fallout. I also think it constantly baffles me how there's a sort of celebration that a certain set of consumers are willing to pay a little bit of a premium for sustainable food or for fair trade food, when actually I think we should be asking the question, why is the majority of food artificially cheap? Because it's either grown on the backs of some of the poorest around the world, or low income wages, or harvesters or packers in various aspects of the supply chains, or it's not incorporating the full environmental cost, whether that's, just think of the transport costs that environmentally that are not embedded in food. And then, of course, the reaction is, well, how do people afford higher prices? Well, that just shows we've got a bigger issue to tackle as collectively. We need to make sure that people have sufficient incomes that they can afford to pay food that is properly priced. So constantly, it's not enough just to play whack-a-mole and attend by crisis, symptom by symptom. We need to really understand how some of these things link together, and so often it comes to how we really think about the role of the economy. I just want to pick up a couple of colleagues' remarks. I think it was Anna mentioned the carbon border adjustment scheme. I'm just recently moved back to Australia, and my goodness, they are noticing. There is such discussion here around Australia going to be left behind, its involvement in markets like the EU, if it does not get up to speed. And also, I guess, a similar story with, as I think, Anna, again, you were saying this around how business really pushing government to up its game. And just an anecdote, I was hearing that there was a bunch of European-based ESG investors who visited the West Australian government, and the West Australian government was touting for their investment. And the businesses just said, unless you sort out your credentials here, you're not getting 1 penny of our money, 1 cent of our money. And the government is reeling from that and really, really taking on board the fact that this wave of finance that it could be accessing to build the sort of infrastructure it needs, to build the sort of housing and so on, to invest in the sort of economy we need, will not be available to it if it doesn't up its game in how that's delivered. So these sorts of mechanisms and this sort of leadership from business is really important.
Thank you, Katherine. We have several other questions coming from the audience as well, and taking that we have only 10 minutes. So I'll wrap these up, and this will be then also your chance to provide the final remarks that you may have. Sander Happerds had a question to Hans. Apart from LNG, are there other examples of the so-called transition solutions that you see as risky for leading to lock-ins and stranded assets? Emily Thompson mentions and writes that it seems like there's still a dichotomy between our goals of climate resilience, climate neutrality, climate justice, and then the idea of capitalist competition and growth that is still considered at the heart of the most policies and legislation in EU and national politics. How do we tackle this and foster structural change while this dichotomy is present? And then I would have, if there's time, I would have one final question I would pose in, is that let's fast forward 7 years to 2030. And being an optimist in my heart, let's envisage that we are on a solid path to creating a well-being economy, basis for sustainable prosperity, where businesses and people are thriving within planetary boundaries. We're having the same conversation, which, by the way, has been fantastic. Thank you so much for that. We're discussing measures taken in the early 20s, the good and the bad. What would you highlight as being the one thing, the one driver that got us on the right track during these crisis-prone times? If you have a chance to react to that, I would love to hear from you. Should we go in the same order? So Hans, would you like to go first?
Yeah, very briefly, I suggest that I follow up with Sander on his question, because we know each other. Yes, there are many examples in what we have called the optimization paradigm of existing technologies, where we've poured billions into technologies that we knew were actually dead-end streets and that were interim solutions. 30 years of car emission standards have reduced emissions, but we knew quite a long time ago that combustion engines would never deliver sustainable mobility, let alone the business model around them. So that's where, I mean, and in the food system, there are examples, so quite a number. The fundamental question on capitalism and the growth model, I think Katherine said quite a bit about the teleology of our economic model. And I think it's worthwhile to mention that the global economy is more than $95 trillion. And the whole objective is to shift that economy fundamentally towards sustainability. And there is no way we will get there if we do not fundamentally address the logic of the system. And it's based on capital and investments. And that is not a Marxist statement. It is the essence of our model. And probably capital is the factor of production where we have put least demands, least follow-up in terms of sustainability criteria and legitimacy there. So initiatives like green finance and the gathering of central bankers on these is absolutely critical. We can't get together $100 billion in the climate negotiations. I mean, those are important for political legitimacy and to support the poorest countries and the most vulnerable. But compared to the global economy, where the real shift towards carbon neutrality needs to happen, it's actually rather minuscule. So the role of capital and investments is absolutely critical. Yeah, and there may be a last remark. Yes, businesses are pushing, and I know some that are pushing for high standards and security, but a lot of business organizations are going at the speed of their slowest 25% members, which is why they invest an inordinate amount of lobbying money into slowing down things and not speeding them up. Yeah, and so the World Business Council for Sustainable Development could play a big role in sorting out where the ones are that want to slow down and where the ones are that really want to come with the breakthroughs and completely focus on those. It's badly needed in both senses. We need to speed up, but also we need businesses to get out of the mess that we have created. So thanks.
Thank you, Hans. Then I'll hand over to Christian.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I think you said time frame 2030. I think the biggest challenge we have right now is to see to that Ukraine wins the war, and that comes out as setting a clear line that kind of action that Russia took 364 days ago, that is not something that we set up a system so that we are, as far as possible, can avoid such a situation for the future. And following on that one, the reconstruction of Ukraine will be immensely important for the economy, but also for the environment and Europe, generally speaking. The second element, I think, is what Hans is pointing to, namely how the economy can become more conducive towards the green transition and be supporting that fully. And I think there I'm slightly more optimistic than Hans. I see a financial system which is moving in that direction with the green finance, but also with the whole impact industry that's going forward, but not least because of consumers, owners that see this now as being important and thereby moving into it. And what I also see is innovation coming forward very strongly. And in terms of elements which are going to be important, I personally believe that the emission trading system will be Europe's contribution, hopefully globally, for addressing at least a fairly big part of the issue of going fossil free. So these were the elements I would like to point to.
Thank you so much, Christian. Anna.
Thank you, Annika. And maybe sort of very briefly to build on what you were saying, one of the reasons why WBCSD recently has put sort of quite strict membership criteria in place is exactly what you were saying, that we sort of have to, go faster and not as slow as the slowest, but, as fast as we actually need to go. So I think that's one of the things that's really dear to our heart as well, that real progress is made and we sort of move beyond greenwashing and all these other things, but we actually sort of move towards action. And I think it's this idea of accountability, sort of setting goals is great. We actually need to take action and then measure progress against those goals. So I think so I really want us to see us getting to that point over the next couple of years, that we have a system in place that enables accountability to be created. In order to create accountability, you have to be able to measure where companies and organizations and nations are at, and also see sort of how they progress over time. We are not there yet. Just to give a very, very sort of small example, and I know some of the people on the call here will be able to relate to that, but at the moment, businesses look at their emissions off the back of, especially if they look at their supply chains, off the back of average data. We're making sort of decisions off the back of average data. You would never do financial accounting using average data from sort of the industry. Why are we doing the same for emissions? So there's some very specific pockets where we need to sort of intervene to be able to then measure progress over time. And the other thing that I think is really, really key, and again, Hans, I completely agree with you, it's the market incentives. At the moment, the capital system that we have does not reward green growth. It doesn't give a lower cost of capital to organizations that are performing sort of and really trying to move the dial, and that needs to change. Funnily enough, the insurers, for example, have really cottoned on to sort of what's coming, and they are pricing this into sort of, the insurances that they give and sort of how they approach it. So capital needs to follow suit. And I think there's a big untapped space there that needs to sort of be brought into line. If you're seeing oil and gas companies handing out incredibly big dividends, at this sort of time and age, because of the profits they're making off the back of climate destroying technologies and sort of, fossil fuels and others, I think there's something wrong in the system. That fundamentally, the capital bit, I completely agree, that needs to change. And I really hope we get to that by 2030, because without that, all the good things we're talking about, I think we're not going to get to, and we're not going to manage to do. So thank you for having me, and great discussion, everyone.
Thank you, Anna. Katherine.
Yeah, in the 30 seconds left. Emily, really great question. And yeah, I hope I wasn't subtle in sort of getting over the message that I am extremely obsessed with growth, actually, in that we need to think much harder about disentangling the means and ends, and not see growth as a goal in and of its own right, and assume that grow the economy, everything else will be fine. It'll automatically reduce poverty, it'll address inequality, it'll give us a means to sort out environmental problems, because growth has had its chance and it hasn't stacked up, it hasn't delivered on enough fronts. So what we need to do is be much more incisive about what sort of growth for whom. So that's why I say be fair weather friends of growth rather than its ever faithful followers. And it speaks to Anna's last point there around average data. I mean, so often we think about your per capita measures, which just basically average out the distribution, how different groups are faring, which we see with the different spatial inequalities, different demographic inequalities, is no longer good enough, and it's tearing the system apart. So taking a much richer lens to how our economy is performing and for whom is absolutely central. And in terms of your question, Annika, the one thing that got us there, this is such a hard question because we need a whole jigsaw puzzle of changes. But if I have to, because it's Thursday night for me here, pick one, I think it is more of those pro-social business models that see profit not a goal in its own right, but as a vehicle to play a really proactive role in being part of the solutions. And thanks for this conversation. It's been really fun.
Thank you so much. Thank you for all of our speakers. Thank you for the participants, for your questions, for your remarks. It's impossible to summarize the discussion, but I think just the width, the depth of the conversation, it's been wonderful to being able to address so many of the challenges, but then also the solutions and just the ways forward. And ultimately what we need is political courage. We need imagination, we need innovation, we need leadership, and obviously we need systems thinking. And we need to stop costly dependencies on harmful practices. And many of these things we can do now. So it is just the question of just shifting our logic, the thinking, to get us where we need to go. And as the discussion today has reminded us, there is a lot at stake. And the decisions taken in the EU, in the member states, across businesses, across society today will hugely impact the prospects for European competitiveness, for our prosperity, for the well-being, and we need to get this right. So thank you so much for joining this discussion. We very much look forward to follow-up discussions because this certainly is not the end. And wishing you all a very good day and all the best. Thank you.